families. And we're going to look at three main things. Firstly, estate planning and will drafting. And I'll explain to you why we start with that. Then planning for the unexpected. And lastly, savings and retirement. Right, so we start when we first see a client. The first thing we look at really is estate planning and drafting your will for a number of reasons. This is really the foundation of your financial planning. Now, why is this the case? Firstly, we get to know what your family consists of. Very important in planning for your family is your marital regime. Are you married in community of property? In other words, you didn't do an antenuptial contract when you got married, because in South Africa, the default, if you don't do an antenuptial contract, is that you married in community of property. Or are you married by an antenuptial contract? And does that antenuptial contract include accrual? If you married before 1984, it would not include accrual, because accrual really only came in 1984. So we need to know this, because it's absolutely vital. It affects your tax. For instance, if you are in community of property, any interest earned by either spouse is actually shared between the two spouses. If you've married by antenuptial contract or ANC with accrual, any interest earned by a particular spouse is taxed in the hands of that spouse. It isn't divided between the two spouses. So it's very important to know that. Also, we need to know who owns particular assets. If it's in community of property, in fact, every asset is jointly owned by the two spouses. So the husband will own half the house and the wife will own half the house. And if you have a holiday home, the husband will own half the holiday home and the wife will own half the holiday home. If the husband has a bank account, in fact, half of it belongs to the wife. So we need to know these things, because we need to plan with that in mind. Next thing we want to know about are children. What ages are your children? Do your children have any special needs? Maybe you have a child who has disabilities, which will mean they will never be able to earn an income of their own. So do we need to make some sort of provision to cope with that need? Are your children of an age where they can look after themselves, whatever? So we need to know this, and we need to know, what are your aspirations for your children? Do you want them to go to a private school? Do you want them to go to university? If they go to university, do you want the possibility of an overseas university? What do you hope for so far as your children are concerned? Are you trying to build intergenerational wealth and a legacy for your children? These things we need to know so that we can add that into our financial planning. The next thing we need to know are there any previous marriages or any children from previous marriages? You've got to remember that if you have a previous marriage and perhaps you're paying alimony to a previous spouse, or you're paying maintenance for children from a previous marriage, when you die, that does not stop. That has to continue after your death, and it is a charge against the estate. So your current family might in fact find that they're not getting what they, if you were to die, not getting what they expect, because a previous spouse or children from a previous marriage are in fact entitled to some of the assets in your estate. So we need to know that. So really, the will gets us to know exactly where you are, what your hopes are, what your dreams are, what your obligations are, etc. We also need to know what benefits are not payable to the estate. And there are certain benefits that are not payable to the estate. So for instance, ceded insurance. So if you have an insurance policy, for instance, to cover the bond on your house, it might be ceded to the bank. If you die, the policy of insurance would be paid to the bank. They would use the money to settle the bond, and anything over would then be paid into your estate. So let's say you've got a bond for R1 million and you've got an insurance policy for 1.5 million ceded to the bank, and you die, the bank gets the 1.5, settles the bond with $1 million, and the other $500,000 they will then pay into your estate. You might have ceded insurance to a spouse. So maybe you've got a policy so that if you die, your wife or your husband gets a certain lump sum, or maybe one of your children, or maybe some other relative, or maybe a charity, maybe a trust fund, whatever. So any insurance policy that has a beneficiary on it or is ceded will go to that beneficiary or to that institution or individual to which it's ceded. And the next thing, and people forget this, is that your pension and retirement annuities do not form part of your estate. People don't realize it, but in fact, pension money and retirement annuity money doesn't actually belong to you. It really belongs to the fund, and you merely have rights by virtue of your membership of the fund. So you can have 100 million in your pension fund and it will not form part of your estate, no estate duty on it. It will go to the dependents, your dependents, as defined by the Act. So we need to know this because there might be considerable in ceded insurance, beneficiary nominated insurance, and in your pension fund. Many people's pension funds, in fact, represent their largest asset. So we need to know about that so that we know to include that in our planning for the family's finances. Then we look at assets and liabilities. Now, any of you who have done your will through a lawyer might have found that they didn't do this. Lawyers, when they do wills, they know the law. They will give you a beautiful, perfectly legal will, but they might not have looked at your assets and liabilities and worked out the way that we would work out as to whether the will is actually practical. So that's why we're going to ask you when we do your will, what assets do you have and what do you owe? When we get this information, it then helps us to structure a plan for a family so that we can make sure that assets are protected, that any debt is paid off, etc. So what we would be looking at is firstly, what do you own? Is it structured, invested in the most appropriate manner? So we want to look, let's say you've got some unit trusts. We want to look, are those unit trusts invested in a way to give you the outcome that you hope for? Is your outcome something short-term in the next 2 or 3 years, or is your outcome something that you might want in 10 or 15 years' time? So we look at this so that we can make sure that everything is as appropriately invested as possible. If you own a business, it's very, very important. There are very special needs and very special provisions that are required to ensure that your family actually benefit from the business if you die. You really, really need specialist advice on that to ensure that the business is worth something to your family. So many people rely upon the value of their business as a valuable asset in their estate, not realizing that if they die, that business is probably worth much less than they expect. So we need to make plans to ensure that that business provides for the family in the way that the owner hopes it would provide for the family. And a very important thing is, do you have any overseas assets? It's absolutely vital that we sort this out. I had a client who died back 2 years ago. She had a bank account in the UK. And for us to actually sort that bank account out, we had to hire lawyers in the UK. Their starting fee, they wouldn't even look at it until we'd paid them £500. Now, £500 is 12,000 rands. Fortunately, there was about £40,000 in the account, so it made sense for us to pay 12,000 to get that £40,000, 800, a million rand, somewhere in that region. But if you have overseas assets that are relatively small, you might find the costs of us recovering them in the event of your death are actually exceed what they are worth. Unfortunately, we have to do that because if someone dies, we can't leave assets lying around. And bank accounts are easy and relatively cheap. If you think 12,000 rands is cheap, relatively cheap to sort out. If it's shares, if it's fixed property like houses or something like that, it is much, much, much more expensive. And the other thing you have to remember is that any assets overseas are subject to estate duty in those countries. In England, it's quite a large amount before you pay estate duty. But in America, it's about $40,000. Anything over $40,000, and you're going to have to pay estate duty in America. And we have much better ways of holding those assets in a way that you won't have to pay those exorbitant fees, and you won't have to pay estate duty. So we need to know if our clients have overseas assets, and we need to make sure that those are sorted out in such a way that if they die, the family will have access to them at little or no cost. Right, then the next thing we look at is, what do you owe? You must remember that if you die, whatever you owe is actually a burden against the estate. So if there's still a mortgage on the house, your estate has to pay that. And they might have to pay it by selling the house. And we need to look at that. That's very important. We do not do wills where we know that we are going to have to go to a widow or a widower and say, sorry, you're going to have to get out the house because we're going to have to put it on auction because there's no money in the estate to pay the bond. So it's very, very important that we know these type of things. Do you have loans? It might be a loan from the bank. It might be a personal loan. It might be a loan for furniture or whatever. Car financing, credit cards, maintenance claims, etc. These are all things that we need to look at and make sure that we make provision that there's money to pay all those things so that the family are not burdened with those debts. Right. Something that people often neglect, and I must admit that before I was in this business, I was a teacher, and it was something I had neglected. Excuse me, and that is having liquidity in the estate. In my personal capacity, I had life policies and endowments and things like that. All of them were beneficiary nominated to my wife. Until I came into this business and I realized that if I was to die, we needed a bit of money in the estate. You need to pay settled debts, you need to pay executors fees, you need to pay masters fees, you need to pay state duty if your estate's large enough. You need to pay transfer fees if you have to transfer properties, etc. And so what I had to do was actually cancel the beneficiary nomination on one of my life policies, so that the life policy would actually then pay into the estate and provide liquidity, the money to actually wind up the estate. So this is something that we always look at. There must be liquidity in the estate. We don't want to have to go to a widow or a widower and say, sorry, we're going to have to sell the car or sell the house or sell the business or sell some of your furniture in order to have the money to wind up this estate. And by far the cheapest way of having liquidity in your estate is to have some life insurance. It's really, really is cheap. It's the best way to do it. And so we need to know if there's a need for life insurance in order to provide liquidity. And then a very important thing is we need to look at what do you want to happen with the assets in your estate. You've worked hard, you've saved, you've sacrificed to accumulate wealth. And we want to ensure that that wealth is passed on in a way that meets your wishes. So we need to look, firstly, are your wishes legal? For instance, you can't put provisions on a bequest. So you can't say, I leave R1 million to my daughter on condition that she marries Joe Soap. You can't do that. So we need to look, what are your wishes? Are they legal? Firstly, and secondly, are they practical? So for instance, you leave your house to your children. Okay. It might be practical, it might not be. How well do your children get on? What are they going to do? Are they going to rent the house? Are they going to live in it together? You know, what is it? I leave my business to my son. Well, if your son's a toddler or an infant or even a teenager, is that practical? So we need to look at that. And lastly, do your assets match your wishes? You can't put in your will, I want my daughter to go to Oxford University, unless you've put 5 or 6 million rands in your, this is 5 or 6 million rands in your estate to actually fund something like that. So we actually look at the practical matters. Your lawyer will ensure that your will is totally legal, but because they often don't wind up estates, etc., and don't deal with this on a regular basis, you might find that your will is impractical because the assets don't actually match your wishes. So just minor considerations that we also include in the will, but also it gives us an idea of our clients' wishes and aspirations. Would they like to be buried or cremated? Do they want to donate organs? Now, both of those actually require, you can put it in your will, but may require documentation that will be available prior to the will actually being implemented, because by the time the will comes to be implemented, it's too late. The person's been buried or cremated, or organs are no longer viable, etc. We also offer a living will, and this is to give instructions to your family, to your doctor, as to what happens in the case where you are in a state where you are not going to be able to recover, but you can be kept alive artificially. What are your wishes under those circumstances? Do you wish to be kept alive artificially, or do you not? So this just assists families in making very, very difficult decisions. If they know you've got a living will and you've stipulated a certain thing in the living will, it just reinforces their ability to make a decision under very, very stressful and upsetting conditions. Something that wills often don't look at: what happens in the event of family obliteration? What happens if the whole family's in a car and involved in an accident and they're all wiped out? Your will says, if I die first, it goes to my wife. If when she dies, it goes to the children, and then it stops. So what happens if you all die? I've got some clients who have a very lucrative family business, and all the family members work in it. Children, mothers-in-law, fathers-in-law, the whole lot, all work in it. And their wills are, if I die, it goes to my wife. If when she dies, it goes to the children. If they die, it goes to my brothers and sisters, etc. And the whole family were going for a holiday to Victoria Falls. And I said to them, well, are you all flying in the same plane? Because that's an issue. That is an issue, that the entire family could be wiped out if you're all in the same plane. So, we need to look what happens in the event of a family obliteration. Does it go to a brother? Does it go to an uncle or whatever? Then we need to look at, do you need to appoint guardians for minor children? So these are children under the age of 18. If both parents die, then there needs to be a legal guardian to make legal and financial decisions on behalf of those children. And lastly, is there a need for testamentary trusts? Testamentary trusts are trusts set up by virtue of a testament, in other words, by virtue of a will. And these trusts are necessary under certain circumstances. Let's say you're leaving everything to your spouse, but your spouse is a spendthrift and would get through the money in a short period of time. Maybe we need to set up a trust such that the trustees can actually control the reckless spending of that beneficiary. I had one case where a widow had two children. One was fine, but the other one was in his 50s, but was a drug addict. So in terms of her will, we set up a testamentary trust so that his share of the estate went into there, and the trust paid for his maintenance, but didn't give him a large lump sum that he could just go and blow on drugs. So we need to look at that. Do you have a child, for instance, who has a disability that means that they can't work or can't make decisions on their own, despite the fact that they might be in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s? Then we need to have a testamentary trust where we have somebody looking after that money on their behalf. Right, so the next thing is we need to plan for the unexpected. So we now have got a picture of your family. We now know everybody's there. We know what you want to do. We know what assets you've got. We know what liabilities you've got. So we can make plans as to how best to handle your estate. But then we need to look at what happens if the unexpected happens. Now, I'm just taking one example. October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And we're just looking at this. What happens if you are a female and you are diagnosed with breast cancer? It can cause absolute havoc with your finances. Even if you're on medical aid, the medical aid will pay for your treatment, but often you find that you cannot as hard as you worked before. You often off for long periods of time for chemotherapy, etc. And so you need some sort of financial support to get you through it. Excuse me, I'm just going to turn my microphone off while I have a cough. Okay, I'm back. So we could look, for instance, at severe illness cover for you, because this would provide you with financial support if you're diagnosed with cancer or any other severe illness. And this cover can also include children. So yeah, and even unborn children. So it could mean that if you have a child that is born with some sort of congenital problem, there might very well be cover for that child as well. Remember, medical expenses are a significant cause of bankruptcy. I had clients, I'm based in Edenvale, and they were in Glen Hazel, and owned factories, etc., in Wynberg and that area. And the husband had a heart attack and had to have a triple bypass, and the triple bypass went wrong. And of course, it went wrong on a Sunday when everything's double, etc. And I think it had to be redone twice. And it ended up with them losing most of their factories. So you really need to make some provision for this.
Our financial advisor had come to see us a month or so before my diagnosis, and he had been very, very clear that we needed to put dread disease cover in place, and we didn't get it done on time. I think what was going through my mind is, will I die? Will I live? What was going through my partner's mind was how we would survive this financially. But the financial implications were a bit catastrophic. We took years to recover. It just keeps going on and on and on. And if you don't have a lot of money, it is going to cost an absolute fortune. There's no way I would have known I had breast cancer, and I would have had cover in place. There's life on the other side of cancer. There really is a lot of.
Why do we need cover for severe illness? Firstly, high medical costs. And as I say, your medical aid will probably cover most of it, but there might be large out-of-pocket expenses, particularly because your medical aid might only pay medical aid rates, and your surgeon, your oncologist, etc., might charge 3 to 6 times medical aid rates. Then you have a loss of income because you can't work, or you can only work half a day, or you can't work for a couple of days around your chemotherapy, etc., etc. And sometimes in medical aids, there are gaps and high deductibles and exclusions, etc. And then there might be long-term care and rehabilitation, which also can be quite costly, and most of that will not be covered by medical aid. Then something that people often neglect, and that is disability cover. People forget that disability is more expensive than death. If you think about it, if someone dies, you have a funeral, and after that, your expenses are finished. But if someone is disabled, they're still alive, they still need to be cared for, they still need to be fed, the medical aid still needs to be paid. So disability is exorbitantly expensive. So it's very, very important to have sufficient disability income, or else you and your family could suffer devastating financial hardship. So you really need to plan such that you do have sufficient disability cover. And disability cover, sorry, Kaylee just put the cover on a bit early. Disability cover can also cover your children. I, for instance, as soon as my children were old enough to have cover, that's age 14, I ensured that they had disability cover, because I'd seen cases where people were devastated financially by the disability of a child. One lady, I was trying to help her with retirement planning, and she said, I cannot. I've got no money to save for retirement because I've got a quadriplegic daughter, and that just takes all my money. And I realized that if one of my children became disabled, it could actually be devastating for me. So as soon as they reached the age of 14, which is the age at which you can insure them, I ensured that my children had very comprehensive disability cover. Well, the most comprehensive. I actually bought the most you can for a student, which at that stage I think was 15,000 rands a month, a payment of 15,000 rands a month if either of them was disabled. So that I knew that if, God forbid, either of them had been disabled, at least I would have had 15,000 rands a month paid by Old Mutual to help me towards the costs of that.
And then a ton of steel fell on my foot. It destroyed my foot completely. I was admitted into hospital again. The doctors took x-rays and all of that, and the doctor said, look, you need to amputate your leg. So the next morning, right after the day the accident happened, I was asleep. I opened my eyes, it was 8 o'clock in the morning. And David Hall was sitting in the chair across from me. The communication side from Old Mutual to us was so heartwarming and gave us the assurance of, look, guys, we're on it. So eventually I lost my job as well. Where to now? And David Hall gave me that letter and he said, Old Mutual's going to pay me my salary for the rest of my life. I mean, how pleasing is that to know that financially you're going to be okay? It brings healing to you. It brings not just physical healing, but financial freedom. So being a keen cyclist, if you're cycling with people and they come and tap you on the back and say, hey dude, hats off to you, they see more than just the guy with our leg. And that's the opportunity you get to speak to people. My recommendation is to anyone, don't think it will never happen to you. Go to an advisor. Go see someone, trust him, build a relationship, make a commitment, make the right choice.
So now let's just look at the costs of not planning. First of all, if you don't have comprehensive risk cover, there's going to be a financial burden on the family. We need income protection. People forget that their ability to earn an income is their greatest asset. Just look at your salary, multiply it by 12 to find out what you earn every year, and multiply it by the number of years you still have left to work. And you'll see that most of you are going to earn millions in the future. And we need to have insurance in place in case that is not the case. If you can't work, we need to have some means of replacing those millions that you should have earned. And as I say, you can have cover for your children, and that way we can actually ensure that we have intergenerational wealth, that what you've built up in your generation will be preserved and passed on to the next generation, and they can preserve it and pass it on again. Right, so that's what we get at looking at your will, looking at your estate, etc. Now we can look at what can we do for savings and for retirement. A new or relatively new means of saving are tax-free savings accounts. These were introduced by the government a few years ago to try and encourage South Africans to save. South Africans are notoriously bad savers. Compared with the Chinese, for instance, we are absolutely appalling. So the government said, okay, one of the one of the things that prevents people saving is the fact that you have to pay capital gains and you pay tax on your interest and things like that. So let's introduce a tax-free savings where your interest will be tax-free, where any capital gains you make will not be taxed, etc. They did put limits on it, so you can't suddenly come with R1 million and put it in. You're allowed to put 33,000 a year into it. So, sorry, 36,000 a year into it. But it is a useful tool for savings, and it's also liquid. You can draw money out of it, which hopefully you won't do, but you can do that. And it's an excellent way of saving for your children. And if any of you have children and rich parents, speak to the parents and say, you know what, why don't you start a tax-free savings for your grandchildren? That would be a wonderful legacy for grandparents to leave to their children. Just be careful though, you're not allowed to put in more than 36,000 a year. And it's not the contributor that is monitored by SARS, it's the beneficiary. So in other words, the child's ID will be known to SARS, and that child is not allowed to have a tax-free savings of more than 36,000 a year. So if you've got two grandparents that vying with each other for the grandchildren's affections, they can't both put in 3,000. So just be careful that for a particular individual with a particular ID that you do not go over the limits. But it's a wonderful way of savings. And the tax-free savings can be used for education or for saying to your child, you know what, if you don't go to university, what are you going to do when you leave school? Are you going to start a business? If you're going to start a business, you're going to need a bit of seed capital. And if you've had a tax-free savings running for a long time, you know, there would be considerable amount of money in there that they could actually use to start a business. The money could be used for tuition, for school fees. So tax-free savings can really be very useful, particularly if you start when your children are babies, because then you will already have something saved before you start having to shell out for education, etc. Right, then the next thing to look for is retirement savings. And the reason that this is important for the family is you don't want to be dependent upon your children when you can no longer work. So if you plan correctly for your retirement, you can avoid the financial strain on your children. You can live with dignity. And it's very, very important to start early, because by starting early, you have the benefit of compounding. So every rand you put in your 20s is going to be worth hundreds of rands when you come to retire in your 60s. So really, we need to start as early as possible. And most people will have a pension plan at work or a provident fund at work, but generally speaking, this will not provide sufficient for your retirement. So you might need to supplement that with retirement annuities, which is a retirement plan that you yourself put in place. It's not put in place by your employer. And the wonderful thing about all of these is that they're tax deductible. I've got a client who actually, he's very fortunate. He earns a lot of money. So he can put about 30,000 a month into his, well, just under 30,000 because there are limits into his retirement annuities, and he gets about 150,000 back from tax every year as a result. So the fact that they're tax deductible is absolutely wonderful. It really means that for every rand you put in, it's only 60 or 70 cents coming out of your pocket, and the rest, in fact, is being paid by the receiver. So it's a wonderful, wonderful tax planning tool, as well as being a tool to ensure that you have a comfortable retirement when the time comes. Okay, so those are the sorts of things that we do to plan for clients. So now, I just want to look at a few funny little things that people often don't consider, but after 28 years in the business, they're the things that I think about and recommend to clients if they're appropriate. Right, the first thing is for people who've got a lot of money and who are going to die before they run out of that money, or before that money runs out. Rather than have a big estate that might attract estate duty and take time to wind up, etc., consider donating up to 100,000 Rand per annum to your children. So now that's not 100,000 per child, that's 100,000 per taxpayer. So if you are a wealthy person that has got sufficient money for their own needs and are not going to run out of money, and you know that when you die there's going to be a lot of money in your estate, give 100,000 a year to your kids. I had a wonderful old client down in East London, and she at my advice did this for years and years, and she said, you know, I really like doing this because I'm giving my children this money when they really need it. When they've got children at school and struggling with the school fees, when they've got children at university, when they've got a child that needs a car, etc., etc., it's a real help. So you're allowed to donate up to 100,000 per taxpayer and not pay any donations tax. Anything over 100,000, you actually should declare to the receiver and pay donations tax of 20%. And the wonderful thing about this is not only does it benefit your children, but it also can reduce the size of your estate and therefore reduce estate duty, reduce the costs of winding up your estate, etc. Next, use beneficiary nominated investments to avoid assets going into the estate. This didn't used to be so important when the Master's Office, which is the government department responsible for estates and winding up estates, was efficient. But nowadays, the Master's estate is horribly inefficient. And it can take 2 years or so. A normal estate, it's taking us 2 years to wind it up. So in order to ensure that assets get to the people we want to have the assets as quickly as possible, make use of beneficiary nominated investments. I had a client, in fact, the same one with the overseas bank account that I mentioned earlier. And I could see that she was not going to last long. And so I actually advised her to take a very large amount of money, several million, and put it in a beneficiary nominated investment for her 2 daughters, both of whom lived overseas. And I said to her, that is so that if you die, your daughters will get the money quickly. And that was the case. She died 2 years ago. The estate still hasn't been finally wound up. A lot of it has been sorted out, but not finalized. But they've had that money from that beneficiary nominated investment now for months. So it's very useful. Also, if you're married in community of property, remember, if you die, your spouse's assets actually half belong to you and vice versa. So in winding up the estate, it might make it difficult for the surviving spouse to actually access money, etc. So it might be useful to have a beneficiary nominated investment so that if you die, your spouse will have access to that money and be able to use it while the estate is wound up. And this I've spoken to you already. Get your child their own cover from the age of 14. First of all, children's premiums is cheap, and they are underwritten using the parents' income, etc., education as a means of determining what sort of rate they should their premiums should be fixed at. And so it makes it cheap. It really does. Remember, the disability of a child could bankrupt you. So look at that. It's something that is important, and it's a win-win situation. People forget that insurance is always a win-win situation. You win if you don't claim. You pay all that money for all those years and you don't claim. And that's a win because you're not in a wheelchair. You're not a quadriplegic, so wonderful. But if anything does happen, you also win because there is money to look after you if anything does go wrong. And lastly, very, very neglected and very infrequently used, wonderful, wonderful investment tool is something called a voluntary purchase annuity. For people who have money, they have something in the bank, and they need that money to supplement their income. And so they rely on, let's say, the interest from that money. Often that interest is insufficient to actually provide the extra income they require, and therefore either they sacrifice their quality of life and just live on that interest, or they start to eat into capital, and the minute you start eating into capital, your money just disappears so quickly. But a voluntary purchase annuity is a wonderful way because you actually take your capital and you buy an income for life. And that income must pay so long as you're alive. It can be linked to inflation, so it goes up, etc. And a very large part of that income will be tax-free. So it's a wonderful, wonderful tool. I had a wonderful old lady client, and she was really struggling. And I saw she had some money, actually in some matured policies. And I said to her, look, let's do this. Let's use this money to buy a voluntary purchase annuity. And when she saw how it worked, her eyes just lit up and she said, why did nobody ever tell me about this before? And it really gave her the dignity. She was a very dignified lady, the sort that didn't quite put on gloves to come into town, but the sort of person that you would felt that 20 years ago, before she went into town, would have put on a hat and gloves. A real lady, and she was so happy at what this could do for her. So that's something to consider as well if you're struggling for income, but you do have a bit of capital. Okay, any questions?
So the first question is in regards to child cover. Can the child be the policyholder, or does a guardian or parent have to be the policyholder?
Okay, the child can be the policyholder, but generally speaking, I don't do that. In my particular case, I was the policyholder for my children because they were still young at that stage. and you are allowed to take out a policy on your child because there is what is called an insurable interest. Before you can take out an insurance policy on anybody, you have to show that there's a reason for you to insure that person's life. So if you're a parent, you have an obligation to look after your children if they are disabled. And so that provides the insurable interest. Therefore, you take it out for them while they still at school, in fact. What you do then is once they're working, etc., and independent, you can then cede that policy to them and let them pay for it. And it then becomes the foundation of their personal financial planning. They now have maybe a bit of life cover, but mainly disability cover for themselves, and that will be their first bit of financial planning for themselves, and then they can add to it as their needs grow. So I would say, generally speaking, let the parent be the policy owner to begin with.
Then there was a question on this slide. Benefits that are not paid to the state. Can we clarify which benefits are taxed?
Can I clarify?
Which benefits are taxed?
Okay. Ceded insurance is not taxed. Any insurance policies under the Long-Term Insurance Act pay out without any tax. Yes, they will pay out without any tax. Beneficiary nominated insurance also pays out without any tax. Only tax that might be is estate duty, because ceded insurance and beneficiary nominated insurance actually constitute what's called a deemed asset in your estate. It's not an actual asset because it doesn't get paid into the estate, it gets paid to the cessionary or the beneficiary. But it is by law a deemed asset in your estate. So if your estate is worth more than 3.5 million, and it is going, well, if more than 3.5 million of your estate is going to somebody other than your spouse, that would be subject to estate duty. But generally speaking, insurance and ceded insurance and beneficiary nominated insurance don't carry any tax whatsoever. Pensions and retirement annuities will not be taxed unless the recipient cashes them in. So if you die and you've got money in your pension fund or your retirement fund, if the recipient transfers that money into another pension fund or into an annuity of some sort, it will not be taxed. But if they say, no, I don't want that, I want all the cash, then it's going to be classed as a withdrawal and taxed. But interestingly enough, not taxed in the hands of the recipient, but taxed in the hands of the deceased. So there will be tax implications there. But you can actually use pension money almost like a trust fund because it's not in your estate. So if you leave it to a child or a spouse or whatever, and they leave it as a pension, etc., they don't say, I want it paid into my bank account, then it goes totally tax-free. And really, that can be almost like a trust fund that can go from generation to generation. People with very, very big pension benefits can actually have what's called living annuities, and those living annuities can go from generation to generation to generation, providing 3, 4, 5, 6 generations with income, and it will all go tax-free. No other questions? Oh, okay. Right. So our next webinar will be in November, 4th of November, and it will deal with retirement planning. If in the meantime you have any questions or you want anything clarified, etc., please contact me or Kaylee. That's cmog@altmutual.com or vmog@altmutual.com. And there's our practices WhatsApp number there as well. Thanks very much for attending, and hopefully see you next month.